Bienvenue. J'en appelle au quorum.
On today, we've got the room till 6 o'clock. Unless instructed otherwise, I think we'll go, well, I guess I need to get some guidance here. We only have the room till 6 o'clock. So that would give us an hour and 40 minutes. Do you want me to divide it equally between the first panel and the second panel?
Bribe the interpreters.
Or bribe the interpreters? Probably not a good idea. So an hour and 40 minutes is 50 minutes each. So we'll go 50 minutes?
With a quick flip.
Yeah, with a quick turnaround. Okay, so we'll go with Mr. Fadden for 50 minutes.
Also keep all questions to 5 minutes.
We have one
Do
person.
you want to, okay, we can cut a minute off?
First hour, 3 in the second hour.
Yeah, I know, but time is time. Okay, let's just start with 50 minutes. Now, do you want me? Yeah. I'll cut off a minute off the first round. James?
The other option, I see that we got a couple other witnesses are in the room. Why don't we bring up all the witnesses at once and then we just go the full hour?
Because one of our witnesses is not
I
online.
can see if he's ready.
Okay, well, we're making this up on the fly, folks. Do you want to go for the full till 6 o'clock with all 4 witnesses?
Yes.
Okay,
Just a
so,
few seconds to do tests.
okay, we've got to do some tests then. Okay.
Well, can we start the hearing from the current witness at the table and we can bring up,
It's preferable to have tests done first, isn't it?
Yes.
let's just go.
Here we go.
No, let's do the hour and hour, or 15:50. Otherwise, because that's going to take too much time if they're not on, are they online?
They're online.
Okay, then do it. Quick.
So can you
Okay.
suspend?
Okay, that was the short. and I'm going to call on Mr. Fadden for his first 5-minute statement, and then go to each of the other witnesses we have in the panel, and then ask for Mr. Gemello. So with that, Mr. Fadden, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman, and on behalf of the Richards of the world, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about an issue that I've worked on for a large number of years, and I must admit, never with a great deal of success. To some degree, our inability to effect improvements in defense procurement prompted me to reflect on these challenges with limited improvements in mind. It's these reflections that I hope to pass on to you today, and I hope that they're useful. Before I come to my substantive remarks, 2 meta points. First, I served both conservative and liberal governments, and I am convinced my remarks apply to both periods. Secondly, there is no silver bullet to this multifaceted problem. Over the years, I've discussed and studied the DP experience of our allies, and everywhere there are levels of complexity that show elements of similarity with ours. I believe there are 3 groupings or institutions principally responsible for defense procurement: politicians, public servants, and the defense industry. I'll concentrate on the first 2. Let me take them in turn. Politicians entirely appropriately set a number of pan-governmental objectives to be pursued. Each objective on its own may be entirely appropriate and reasonable to pursue. The problem with DP arises when they conflict with one another. So, in the area of defense procurement, military acquisitions potentially conflict with regional development, innovation, industrial, and any number of other objectives. These objectives are then bureaucratized by the public service and add considerable complexity for everyone involved, including the private sector. Over time, all of this develops a culture which itself becomes highly problematic. More on this in a second. I'm not suggesting these objectives should be ignored in the context of defense procurement, but rather their impact should be detailed and made public so that a judgment can be made on the appropriate balance between the objectives, the various objectives. And B, in specific circumstances, not routinely, but not rarely, the public service should be able to recommend and the government accept that the application of some specific objectives should be suspended. These suspensions in support of urgent defense acquisitions should be susceptible of acceptance by Parliament and the media, another area potentially where cultural change would be necessary. Now to the public service. Concern about the reaction of ministers, the House, the media, have made public servants very rule and process-oriented and very risk-averse. I suggest this has become the dominant culture with respect to any public servant who has anything to do with defense procurement. The Federal Accountability Act also does not help, not the act itself, but the way that it's been implemented. I'm not advocating irresponsible action, but rather acceptance of some measure of risk and the possibility of error in favor of more effective acquisitions. In practice, this might mean an environment where acceptance of exceptions to rules in favor of special arrangements can be sought without being career-limiting. One easy example is the public service has become extraordinarily reticent to take any action that raises the possibility of litigation, even though over the years the government wins most of the litigation. There's a real resistance, and this just gridlocks things because of the fear of litigation. Another issue shared by ministers and public services is the principle that defense procurement rules apply across the board, notwithstanding the size or complexity of specific acquisitions. I know here that I'm generalizing, but I believe that this approach should be further developed. For example, increased delegations, fewer rules, when the acquisitions are either not particularly complex or when not a great deal of money is involved. Another matter is illustrated by the debate about the appropriate organization and mandates of departments and agencies involved in defense procurement. Looking at our allies, it's clear there's no perfect model. Whatever model is chosen, it seems to me that it must take into account the political, legal, and cultural environment. Changing our current machinery, which involves a great many departments and agencies, without resolving the various issues and challenges surrounding DP would seem to me to be very problematic. In conclusion, to the extent that the points I have made are valid, I would suggest that they need to be addressed together if a material improvement in DP is to be brought about. As these issues involve multiple departments and legal and regulatory machinery issues. They can only succeed if reforms have the support of the Prime Minister. A single minister, a single department ain't going to make material changes in this area. It has to be a pan-government operation. In the end, cultural issues may be as important as substantive ones. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Fadden. Mr. Foster, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been engaged in industry for 7 years. While I am a firm believer in competition, I'm also very much a proponent for getting the right equipment for our Canadian Armed Forces in terms of delivery schedule, period of performance, capability tied to interoperability, cost, and of course, long-term and sovereign sustainability. We are not different from government in this respect. Our company's success is very much dependent on the same desired outcomes. My CEO detests red programs probably more than government does. Canada has one of the most complex procurement processes that is costly in terms of time and money. The geopolitical situation will require faster and more effective procurement to ensure that the Canadian Armed Forces remains operationally relevant. Faced with a personnel deficit, the Armed Forces should work closer with industry and adjust some of the default constructs with the procurement and in-service support processes. Some recommendations. Number one, avoid high-risk firm fixed-price developmental programs. By their very nature, developmental programs will face some unknowns in terms of the full cost required to develop a capability. There are many deliberate developmental U.S. programs that take years and significant cost to develop. Non-recurring engineering paid by a launch customer OEM is not always cheap and does not always bode well for schedule, cost, or risk. Canada needs to understand better what level of developmental program risk they are entering into and plan accordingly in terms of both cost and schedule. Programs should be competed when they need to be competed and not for the sake of competition. Competition is healthy and should be a matter of course when two products or capabilities have comparative offers. If there is only one product or capability that meets the CAF's requirements, and Canada is not prepared to appropriately fund a developmental program for another offering to create competition, then it should not be competed. Similarly, Canada's true requirements should not be watered down to force a competition. This ultimately undermines the CAF's capability. These principles should apply to both product acquisitions and in-service support. For proven off-the-shelf solutions, the launch customer have invested, developed, and in many cases have competed the solution. Canada should take advantage of this to avoid delays in schedule and cost. Number three, Canadian industry should be even more integrated than ever in the U.S.-led North American supply chain. For example, the over-the-horizon radar project should be an aligned U.S. and Canadian solution for NORAD with a cross-border and integrated industry. The U.S. is developing spiral programs to invest and develop future capabilities in radio software, night vision equipment, and command and control systems. An example is Project Convergence that is focused on radio software and command and control. Canada should deliberately partner and invest in these concepts and better integrate our supply chain into the developed solution. Canada should incentivize companies to invest in Canada to better integrate the supply chain. R&D investment within Canada should be more focused, longer term, and support those capabilities that have the best chance to succeed in a competitive global market. Today's export success of the Westcam MX series cameras started from government industry R&D over 50 years ago. A longer-term commitment within both industry and government is required if Canada is to be competitive. Canada is a relatively small contributor in terms of military equipment development. Working together with industry to identify those areas where Canada is really competitive and investing appropriately would better position our country in the global market. Canada should better develop and sustain its in-country, in-service support capabilities, including engineering support to ensure sovereign operational readiness. Over the years, for political and operational reasons, in-service support centers of excellence have been developed in Canada, and this past investment should continue to be leveraged. Canada should consider longer-term investment to maintain these centers of excellence to ensure operational sovereignty and enhanced engineering capability. Recompeting these capabilities by default rather than by necessity is costly, causes disruption, and degrade support to readiness for several years during this process. The Canadian Armed Forces have a personnel capacity issue with no short-term solution. Therefore, Canada should integrate industry support services more into its readiness plans to ensure Canada can meet its defense obligations at home and abroad. In conclusion, to ensure that Canada's military remains operationally relevant requires a disruption to our current procurement processes and thinking. Industry is ready to engage and help. Thank you.
Roger. Mr. Shimuka, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you for letting me speak to the committee today. For my remarks, I'd like to focus a bit on defense procurement in the past and the present and in the future. Looking back, one of the most difficult periods for the Canadian Armed Forces in recent history was the late 1970s and early 1980s. Successive governments had cut into the military budget, downsizing and reorientating the forces while delaying modernization. By 1980, the Canadian forces had faced obsolescence in the face of significant advances by the Warsaw Pact militaries. While downsizing had cut the military standing forces, it still retained a capable administrative system with enough institutional memory to execute these new programs. By 1990, the military replaced a number of its key capabilities, such as the CP-140, the CF-18, and the Leopard 1, while other ones, like the Halifax-class frigate and the Northwest Warning System, were on the cusp of being deployed. On the surface, Canada's situation today kind of resembles like the 1980s, and may even seem to be on the same trajectory if the 2017 Strong Secure and Engage was executed upon as envisaged. Unfortunately, the reality is far worse now than it was back then. Many of the same systems that we acquired in the 1980s are far beyond their rust-out dates and are not anticipated to be replaced for another decade or more due to failing program execution. While defense spending has increased over the past 8 years, much of it has gone to operational accounts due to growing international commitments. This has masked the growing dilapidated state of the military's capital base. In other words, our system of procurement is fundamentally broken. Deliveries of major capabilities can now be counted in decades, whereas years should be the norm. The remotely piloted air system, which will deliver a medium-altitude unmanned aerial vehicle, is about to enter its 17th year of existence without delivering a platform. By comparison, many of our allies, such as the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, have brought equivalent systems into service in under 4 years. These failures have occurred in an inopportune moment. As the international security environment has deteriorated rapidly in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and China, in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and China's destabilizing efforts in the Indo-Pacific. Our allies have increased spending and launched a broad modernization of their forces, whereas Canada's efforts seem to be stalled by comparison. In short, the system of acquisition is fundamentally misaligned from the focus of delivering critical defense goods to our soldiers. Over the past 4 decades, it's become progressively slower and less able to meet the national defense needs for several factors. The first has been the increase in non-defense objectives in procurement, such as procurement, most notably delivering economic and social benefits to the Canadian society through these purchases. The second, a number of ill-perceived failures, such as the initial cancellation of the F-35 purchase in 2012, has resulted in ill-considered reforms. It has added layered upon layers of unnecessary process, diluting individual accountability, increasing costs, and delays in these programs. While our present situation is suboptimal, the real cause for concern is the Canadian Armed Forces of the future, which in reality is already here. Reflecting the rapid and fundamental evolutions in our societies we are experiencing due to the confluence of new technologies, warfare is undergoing a similar shift. What I outlined earlier is a 20th century approach to warfighting and procurement. Canada must move into the 21st century. A core consideration is information dominance strategy. In the United States, this exists under the Joint All-Domain Command and Control Approach, or JADC2. This doctrine seeks to aggregate and integrate information from all available sensors, analyze and disseminate it to all units that can effect action. Canada's major allies, including Australia, Germany, and the United Kingdom, are implementing similar approaches and have already drastically affected their force structures and doctrines among all of their services. On a granular level, a platform's connectivity and integration to existing networks and command and control systems are often as important as their physical attributes. Canada is not adjusted to this new reality. While Strong, Secure, and Engaged did contain verbiage that acknowledged joint intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance utility for the battlefield, the Canadian Armed Forces has lagged far behind its allies in this area. For example, if we look at RPAS, the procurement has largely focused on physical capabilities, but minimal consideration was given to how it would play in a broad network environment. This would be akin to buying a top-of-the-line smartphone and only using to make phone calls. In many ways, this shift, when it comes, will be a fundamental one for the department and the government. Its implications will be profound and widespread, affecting not only the military operations, but how we procure systems. For some systems, such as software-enabled capabilities, how we approach will directly affect our military utility. It requires procurement approaches that are flexible, innovative, delivering capabilities that rapidly to our soldiers in order to face these new threats. I thank you for this time today.
Thank you.
I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you. And our final witness is Mr. Jaramillo. You have 5 minutes, please.
Good afternoon, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to address this committee. I am speaking on behalf of Project Plowshares, a Canadian organization dedicated to matters of arms control, disarmament, Canadian foreign policy, and international security for nearly 5 decades. While Project Plowshares does not delve into the intricacies of procurement processes, I wish to bring your attention to several overarching dimensions that warrant consideration when discussing the implications of procurement for the future of the Canadian Armed Forces. Before I delve into these dimensions, I want to be clear that nothing I say here is meant to be interpreted as questioning the undeniable need for the effective preparedness of the Canadian Armed Forces. The primary role of our military must be to protect Canadians and to advance constructive and robust foreign policy objectives that enhance collective security. This duty has the full support of Project Plowshares. Now let's explore some of the key factors that directly or indirectly impact discussions and decisions on procurement. First, the changing nature of the security landscape and the need for clear and relevant policy direction. The world is in a constant state of transformation. Emerging technologies, environmental challenges, and evolving threats are reshaping the very concept of security. As we discuss defense procurement, it becomes imperative that we establish clear and timely policy direction for the future priorities of the Canadian Armed Forces. While Canada's defense policy, as in the document Strong, Secure, and Engaged, was released 6 years ago already in 2017, the rapidity of the evolving security environment requires continual adaptation. Our military must recognize and align its procurement decisions with its evolving role in addressing these emerging challenges. Without a clear vision for the role of the Canadian Armed Forces in responding to existing and new challenges, procurement processes are at risk of being driven more by industry lobbying than by the actual needs of the military, resulting in higher costs yet less effectiveness. Second, increased military spending and global implications. The trajectory of increased military spending and the rapid and continued growth of the arms industry present complex challenges. While security spending is essential, rapid growth in military procurement spending can inadvertently foster a broader military and industrial complex, which may have an outsized influence on key Canadian foreign policy and procurement decisions. We must, therefore, critically examine the consequences of this trend, not only for national security, but also for global stability. Swift increases in military spending, both domestically and internationally, can contribute to a global arms race, heightening tensions and potentially elevating the risk of conflict. Third, misconceptions regarding NATO's GDP-based targets for military spending. Beyond specific procurement decisions, and without denying the need to correct any structural deficiencies in procurement processes, it bears noting that perceptions of Canada as a country with inadequate defense spending can be misleading and merit closer examination, as they are often based on the arbitrary metric of military spending as a percentage of GDP. This applies both to Canada's defense spending in isolation and relative to its NATO allies. Even before the conflict in Ukraine, Canada's defense expenditures totaled more than $26 billion in 2021, ranking it as the 6th largest contributor among NATO members. Put another way, Canada was actually part of the top 20% of NATO's military spenders. On a global scale, according to SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Canada ranked as the 14th largest military spender in the world last year, well within the top 10% of worldwide military spenders. Fourth, balancing a healthy defense industrial base with responsible arms exports. While sustaining a reliable defense industrial base is undeniably essential, Canada must exercise caution in relying on questionable arms exports to support this goal, whether this happens as a matter of strategy, poorly implemented export control regulations, inertia, or a combination of these factors. Our commitment to responsible arms trade and effective export controls considerations must remain unwavering. Striking a balance between supporting domestic industries and upholding legal and ethical obligations is imperative. We must ensure that our exports do not inadvertently contribute to global instability or human rights abuses. Fifth and last, establishing normative safeguards for new technologies. In an era marked by rapid technological advancements, including innovations with military applications, Canada must proactively establish normative safeguards to prevent potential human rights violations and misuse. Embracing technological innovation will be an increasingly crucial element of procurement for the Canadian Armed Forces. However, it is equally imperative to establish a regulatory framework that upholds the rights of Canadians, respects international norms, and ensures accountability. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Jamillo. We're going to do a 5-minute round, not a 6-minute round. So, Mr. Bazan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all our witnesses. I'm going to start with Mr. Fadden. You have a unique perspective, being both former deputy minister and also national security advisor to the PM. When you look at the threat environment we're in, and you look at the challenges we have in procurement, what do we need to be doing to address that current threat environment we're facing to get the kit that we need today and going forward?
Mr. Chairman, I think you put your finger on a significant issue. Defense procurement is not going to significantly increase until the Canadian population and all of you in Parliament recognize that the changed international environment is bringing back substantive threats that we haven't had in the past. So we can talk about defense procurement until we're all blue in the face. If the country doesn't recognize that we need to do something about our foreign and defense policy writ large, the greater threat, I think we're not going to really reform defense procurement. So
if we're looking at what's happening right now with the war in Ukraine, with Russia's invasion, we look at the PRC's destabilizing geopolitical games that they're playing in the South China Sea, the Strait of Taiwan, the Sea of Japan, our Arctic, we need to buy a lot of equipment fairly fast. So would you suggest that we either modify or suspend current rules that are in Treasury Board under, as you said, the Accountability Act, the Industrial Security Benefit or Industrial Benefits Program, the ITBs? Like, those things should be set aside so that we can get a kit bought faster?
I don't think they should all be set aside in all circumstances, but it seems to me that the military should be able to advise the government on those acquisitions that are critical now, and they should waive procurement rules. They should accelerate the processes whenever necessary. So I would imagine that you would never go more than 20 or 25% under these special circumstances. But right now, I can only think of one instance where that's been done in the last 20 years, and it actually turned out being a success story. But in particular, in dealing with IT projects in general, technology changes so quickly that by the time we get around to offering a contract to somebody, usually the technology has changed entirely. So in particular, in those areas relating to technology, we should suspend some rules.
Okay. And so when you look at, and you talked about the political leadership and the political control, and even bringing in, how we do the take away that risk aversion that we have within the public service. So having a special cabinet committee, having a special secretary within PCO to show that leadership to the departments and how important procurement is the right model to go forward without having to change all the departments and setting up special agencies or anything like that?
Yeah, I think that would help what you're suggesting, but I think the biggest change required is going to be a cultural change. The culture in dealing with DP is so entrenched in the public service, and if I may say so, also within the government, that any machinery changes, including the special committee that you're recommending, I don't think is going to go very far. So that's why I'm arguing that If Parliament decides that it really wants DP to be treated seriously, you have to be convinced that the international environment requires it to be done. I mean, to put it bluntly, and I've hung around politicians for all of my career, there are not a lot of votes in defense procurement. So you need to be convinced there's a threat so that people will respond. When there are real emergencies, this country responds in a spectacular fashion. 9/11 comes to mind, what we did in Afghanistan. But the run-of-the-mill operations on defense procurement, it's because I believe we're not convinced collectively that we have a real problem.
Okay. Mr. Shimoka, you talked about, again, the non-defense objectives in procurement. So are you suggesting we go to buy off the shelf and as a way to get around that and do that as much as possible? And how do we ensure that we have a domestic defense industry? Because in times of war, we're going to be needing our domestic industry to step up and build stuff for our Army rather than being put at the end of a list of other countries that are going to be building for themselves first.
About 30 seconds, please.
Certainly every program that is bought for and above a certain threshold has the ITB-VP element to it requiring 100% offset. So in any case, that is going to occur for all these programs. I think we need to have a very clear understanding of what's required for the future warfight, whether we, if we are operating in the Indo-Pacific or if it's in Europe, and understand what capabilities. Certain segments of the Canadian industrial base has that kind of level of technological capability, industrial capacity to support, and we should really rely on those while looking at other areas where we cannot buy domestically and purchase from there as well.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Mr. Collins, 5 minutes, please.
These are good witnesses.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our guests. Mr. Fadden, I'm just, I was so shocked to read the comments that you made in the piece from 2022, where you talked about procurement, and you talked about abandoning or pausing the rules. And I've been an elected representative for almost 30 years now, and if I was to go back to my community and talk about waiving procurement rules, you mentioned the word media in your opening statement. I just can't imagine how that resonates with, so I get internally here why that needs to happen. I think it should happen. But how do we deal with the cultural issue in terms of the public's desire for transparency when it comes to government purchases? You can imagine, having worked here for quite some time, what the opposition would do, maybe with playing with some of those wavering of the rules, so to speak. And so how do we deal with the public, and how do we deal with, by extension, the media, when that's not the norm at any level of government here in Canada?
That's a fair question. I think you start off by developing, this will seem like a contradiction in term, but a package of rules that set out the rules for suspending the rules. You have to be absolutely transparent. When is a piece of defense acquisition critical to the national interest and national security that will allow the government of the day, either side, to say we're going to suspend those rules? I think it has to be utterly and completely transparent. It would be useful if you could get all parties in the House to agree with it in principle. And I think to the extent that the House agrees with this in principle, the media will eventually follow. But I'm really not, I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting the suspension of all rules all the time. Okay.
In terms of it needs to be limited.
But I think you need transparency in respect of the need for that kind of suspension. Only in circumstances where either international conditions or something special in Canada occurs. And I think most Canadians, I mean, you're better judged than I am for this, but I think most Canadians, if you make a clear case that we're sending our soldiers, sailors, and airmen into battle or close to battle without being properly equipped, that is not an acceptable way of proceeding. And I can give you examples, if I think about it, where we've done that. So I think if you come up with that kind of explanation, and only in those circumstances proceed to waive maybe not all the rules, but some of the rules. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that was a great answer. I was looking forward to it, actually. You talked about, or you referenced micromanaging in that same piece in terms of the aversion to risk in the bureaucracy, and that I think is common in all levels of government. And you talked about not being afraid to make a mistake, possibly, with some of these very sensitive files. And there are benefits, though, that come with that, right? Time's one of them. Can you elaborate on that in terms of how much risk should the bureaucracy take when we're dealing with some very expensive files and some very public, high-profile files?
Again, another very good question. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting sort of waving one's arm, opposite a billion-dollar expenditure. But I think in a lot of cases, what I was referring to was the rigid adherence to every sub rule. The fear that the slightest error would be picked up by the opposition of the day or by the media and not be backed by their superiors in the public service. So this is not I'm not accusing politicians here exclusively. It's their superiors in the public service. And somehow, again, I think it's a cultural issue. I don't think you need to change the law. And one of the reasons I mentioned in my remarks that I think for all of this to happen effectively, you're going to need a prime minister who takes interest and sort of says this needs to be done. I mean, I have not been nor ever will be a prime minister, but I can't imagine very many topics that would less interest the average prime minister. But somehow, if we're going to make all these cultural and substantive changes, we need a whole of government approach, and starting at his level with ministers and senior officials. But mostly it's the acceptance that occasionally, I mentioned as an example in my remarks, the fear of litigation gridlocks people now, despite the fact cases before the Canadian International Trade Tribunal and the federal court are usually won by the Crown, but people just sort of freeze. So if we lose a case, it shouldn't be regarded as career limiting or the end of the world as we know it. But right now, it's close to being viewed that way.
Okay, fair enough. Okay. Well, I'll save it for the next round then.
Okay, we'll add it to your total. Madame Normandine, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Yeah, 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My first question will be for Mr. Fadden. One of the criticisms that we hear about procurement is that there are a lot of military people involved, and one of the solutions that has been proposed to me is that we should have the industry involved more so that the procurement works better. A long-term contract, for example, for military clothing could work well. And this might have an impact on risk aversion so that civil servants aren't involved. Well, you're quite right when you say that a lot of military people are involved and concerned. We could have more civilians involved. That's one option. But also we could turn more to the private sector, as you suggest. This will work to a certain extent, but there is a limit to how far we can go down that path because people want to make money if they're in the private sector. We need to have the possibility to intervene in the process or perhaps to review the process. But in certain cases of procurement, it might be the right way to go. Every time there are cuts at the Defense Department, then there are fewer people who have procurement expertise. Thank you. I have one more question that is perhaps more for Mr. Foster, but anyone else can answer as well. You talked about research and development, and from what I understand, the industry can have access to the ITBs, and there are various sectors in which the companies are involved, and it depends on the sectors that we want to promote. In Sherbrooke, for example, we've got some spending, and can that be included in our 2%? So have we, in effect, subcontracted R&D? If I have understood your question correctly, I would say that R&D. Could you just repeat your question, please, so I'm clear? No problem. Should the government invest itself more in research and development rather than, to some extent, subcontracting to the private sector that uses the ITBs to help? Should the government think about its own needs rather than leave it to the private sector? Not necessarily. I think that industry and the government need to work together more. The government invests in research and development in a lot of areas, but not necessarily more so than the private sector. But there is money that is not necessarily well spent because other countries are also investing in the same areas. It would be better, in my opinion, if we worked together to find the best investments for Canada in the global market. So instead of sprinkling the funding over a number of projects, perhaps choose 10 or so projects and the government and the industry work together. So could that make us more effective partners internationally and bring us closer to our 2% target? Yes, possibly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Yaramillo, your organization, Project Plowshares, had introduced a new framing of Canada's security development, and they introduced the 5 Ds of that security envelope, being development, democracy, disarmament, diplomacy, and defense. Could you tell this committee about that concept and how Canada could benefit from that perspective on how we spend that money?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that question. The first thing I will say is that one of those Ds, we refer to this package as the 5 Ds. One of those Ds is indeed defense, and Project Plowshares does not, and it's not my intention here to question or challenge the very basic notion that defense is and can be a very important element of Canada's projection into the world, and that we need an adequate and reliable level of preparedness for the Canadian Armed Forces. However, we consider it problematic when we observe a trend, a trajectory in Canada and globally for an prioritization of defense, especially when this comes at the expense or to the detriment of the other dimensions. Once again, diplomacy, development, disarmament, and democracy. So what we would like to see and what we feel would serve Canada's interests abroad and the global, the international community would be to a more balanced approach to these dimensions, to have more investments in and more intentional investments in diplomacy, in democracy building, in development and in disarmament, in such a way that historically this is true. In as much as there are further investments in those other categories, the need to rely solely or primarily on the defense dimension will decrease. So that is a conversation that needs to be approached with nuance, because it is not saying that defense is not important, but it is saying that it needs to be balanced with other tools at the disposal of Canada for projecting its foreign policy.
So it is about finding that balance and being far more proactive, and I certainly agree with that. Often I feel as though our defense procurement strategy is lacking a human rights-based lens, and there have been major disruptions to our defense supply chain due to defense manufacturing within the sector being conflicting with human rights and the crises that exist within human rights. You recently wrote in the Globe and Mail about Canada's arms trade treaty obligations, specifically regarding Turkey, which was transferring some Canadian exports to unauthorized end users. Can you talk about those treaty obligations and sanctions, what regulation or regulatory changes need to be made to ensure that the Canadian defense exports are protected in that way?
Absolutely. Thanks again for that relevant question. The first thing to say is that it is not just the Arms Trade Treaty. You're absolutely right. Canada is a party to the International Arms Trade Treaty, and that comes with legal obligations. But it is also domestic export controls that Canada needs to abide by when it makes its export decisions. And the reality, the demonstrable reality is that Canada right now, the majority of the Canadian arms exports are going to authoritarian regimes and to questionable recipients. That is true today. That was true last year. That was true the year before, and the year before, and the year before that. More than half of Canadian exports are going to questionable recipients and have been misused. So questionable recipients such as Saudi Arabia, and have been misused, such as in the case of Turkey, where Canada has authorized the export of drone targeting technology produced by L3 Harris Westcam, despite the fact that Turkey has misused them in Iraq and in Syria, has shipped them to Libya despite a UN arms embargo, has diverted them to the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, to its ally Azerbaijan, which has been accused of committing abuses during the course of that conflict. So once again, nuance. There is every need to maintain a healthy and reliable industrial base here in Canada, but the fact that in order to maintain it takes the authorization of arms exports to questionable recipients should really be a cause for concern and for pause.
And just to final up, we were speaking before about changing some of the rules and limiting those rules or having them defined differently. Oftentimes we've heard about the suspension of rules for public good. Can you just comment on that in terms of the conversation on how that impacts human rights?
We're going to have to
Absolutely.
leave Ms. Madison question. I've been very disciplined about 5 minutes because I want to get through 2 more 5-minute rounds. So Ms. Matheson can come back on her question in another round. With that, Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes, please.
In addition to suspending certain rules, what steps must the government take to decouple defense procurement from regional industrial innovational development and innovational development?
Yeah, I wish I had an answer to that, but I think the beginning of that is the acceptance that in some cases defense acquisition is more important than regional economic development. I don't think it needs to be disengaged or disconnected in every single case, but we never make the case anymore. Or, you know, I've sat in what I call the peanut gallery through 2 or 3 governments, ministers talking about this, and there are no criteria, but, you know, a bunch of them will support regional development, industrial development, a bunch will support acquisitions. There are no criteria, there's no rules that they could apply. So I think the beginning of all of this would be the elaboration of criteria that would allow the suspension of regional development considerations, publicly stated, publicly argued, maybe by this committee. But doing it behind closed doors is not a great way of proceeding.
What policies must be put into place to overcome the extreme risk aversion of both ministers and public servants in defense procurement? What steps do we need to trigger this culture change you spoke of?
Culture change, as you know, is one of the hardest things to bring about. I think the first thing would have to be a government-wide statement that, you know, we're expecting public servants to consider effectiveness as well as rules-based approaches to things. We would have to find a few clear cases where somebody made a mistake and they're not sort of taken behind the barn. A lot of it is just behavioral over the course of a short period of time. I don't think it's going to happen very quickly. But today, I mean, part of it would be, and I'm not directing this at you because you're the opposition today. It's the same if this side of the room were in the opposition. You cannot jump on every single little problem that arises in defense procurement as if the government deserves to be defeated. And that's effectively what happens. I understand there's an opposition, and that's what it's meant to do, to oppose. But somehow we need to find a way to raise the threshold of disapproval when something goes wrong. I think people should have to be able to justify when they take risks or they violate a rule, and sometimes you can do it very effectively. One of the things I used to argue when I was in defense was to my colleagues was if you're being asked to do something that strikes you as being nonsensical, ask for an exemption. If I can't give it to you, I'll ask the minister. And in very, very many cases, it's not a big deal. It's not violating human rights, to your point. It's just some rule that somebody set up 15 years ago and that we've never changed because, as in most area of government, you establish a rule and then you add to it over the decades. just a systematic review of the rules to that point might not be a bad thing, because you've got Treasury Board, Public Services, the Privy Council Office, and ISED all adding rules to defense procurement. They don't withdraw very many, but they do tend to add them over the years.
In your estimation, what are the most prominent changes in terms of security threats faced by Canada indicating defense spending should be taking a higher priority?
Well, I think the rise of China and its much, much more aggressive foreign and defense policy, the advent of significant cyber attacks against Canada and all of our Western allies, what Russia is doing in Ukraine. You know, a lot of people question whether we should be supporting Ukraine, but, you know, there but for the grace of God goes any number of other countries. So I think those are the main ones. China, Russia, the rise of cyber, and just generally the disaggregation, the less forceful leadership of the United States, which actually held us together after the Cold War.
What criteria should be used to determine the specific procurement projects that can be exempt from some or all the rules that govern them?
Yeah, I think the first has to be the certification by the Chief of the Defense Staff that whatever is needed now and within a particular time frame. A clear elaboration of why it can't be done with the existing rules, and a clear indication of what specific rule is being suspended for what specific purpose, and how this is going to speed things up. I think to a very great extent it's case-specific, but you've got to start, I think, with a clear, unambiguous statement of the Chief of the Defense Staff that whatever is at issue, it needs to be purchased now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Probably not a good day to be talking about mistakes. Madame Lambropoulos, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have 5 minutes.
Mr. Fadden, I'll start with you. You've spoken to the importance of prioritizing the delivery of equipment above any other objectives. Being a Canadian MP, I also want to make sure that Canada is able and ready to, and that the Canadian Armed Forces are ready to meet whatever goals that they have, and that they're able to be as effective as possible. And being the MP for a riding that's home to several of the companies that are in the industry that we're speaking of today, such as L3, actually, I also understand the importance of helping these industries at least compete against their global competitors and be just as good or better. How can government determine when it's more beneficial to pursue industrial benefits versus when it's best to prioritize getting the right equipment on time?
Again, Chairman, I'm not sure it's possible to elaborate rules that would apply in all circumstances. I think essential to all of this is effective planning in the Defense Department, because in a lot of cases, these things can be predicted. And to the extent that things can be predicted, you can deal with surprises. So I think one of the criteria should be a surprise. You know, something happens on the cyber front. We have significant increase in Russian activity in the Arctic. Whatever the surprise is, something that really takes the military and the government by surprise, it seems to me, should be one criteria. The other should be, I don't think we should ever send our military personnel into a war or a warlike zone unprepared. So if that means and unequipped, I mean, I don't know to what extent it's true, but the example they gave about our troops in Latvia not being equipped appropriately, I think it was with night vision or something. I mean, helmets. I mean, I just don't get this. I mean, you should not send soldiers in a warlike zone without personal protective equipment. That would be one example. So something where there's an immediate risk to the military as well.
That makes sense. You also spoke about how politicians have and set certain objectives, in general that cover many different categories, of course, and that sometimes they conflict. Is there a way to work on these two objectives at the same time? And what is one of the ways that we can help support industry in the long term, even though we are immediately meeting our goals when there are surprises or when there's an emergency situation?
Well, I tried to say in my remarks, I thought all of the objectives were reasonable. So I start from that premise. Regional development in and of itself, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, and we should pursue it whenever we can. But one of the things that I believe Canada, or the Defense Department in particular, is not very good at is prioritizing. You know, we try and do a little bit everywhere, and sometimes we pay the price for that. So I think the main thing that needs to be done is to have an open discussion of these issues, because we don't do that. We simply decide we're going to proceed with the rules as they exist now. Then a whole raft of people get very upset. The government feels compelled to defend, and nothing changes. You know, we have a system of ministerial accountability, so I'm not suggesting that the Chief of the Defense Staff should be allowed to go off on a tangent on his own, but surely there's some way that through a cabinet subcommittee or a subcommittee of the House or something where these cases can be made publicly. And I really do believe that in most cases it's specific to the individual acquisition.
Do you think Canada could be doing more to engage industry and to make sure that they're part of the solution long term? You know, whether it's regularly meeting with defense, you know, meetings between the two in order to build capacity?
Absolutely. I think one thing we should do more of, we're already doing some now, is not giving a particular company, you know, a set of requirements of 1,500 pages, but rather give them 100 pages that requires a result-based acquisition. Our allies, many of our allies use this, but we still tend to the view that every detail requirement should be set out for the company to meet. I think if you give the companies more flexibility, but make it very clear what you want in the end, you incent them to find efficiencies and economies while still reaching the end product. But I also think more of an open dialogue between the public service in particular and the private sector would be useful. And it's one thing that over the course of the last 2 or 3 governments we've somewhat discouraged a little bit. You know, it's sort of risky if you're a public servant to go out to lunch with somebody who works for a company as if, you know, somebody's going to shift a multi-million-dollar contract because somebody buys you a cup of coffee. I'm making a joke of it, but there's some truth in the fact that more dialogue would be useful, much more dialogue. And the fact that the dialogue shouldn't determine the final outcome, that's for the government to decide. But sometimes we bring industry in too late to realize they cannot deliver what we're asking for, and it causes all sorts of delays. So I absolutely think you're right. Much more of this would be helpful.
Thank you, Madame Lambropoulos. Monsieur Thériault, welcome au comité. 2.5 minutes.
You have 2.5 minutes, Mr. Thériault. 2.5 minutes? All right. I'll try to ask a short question. Mr. Fadden, you talked earlier about governance and the fact that it should be more centralized. And you talked about increased effectiveness that could result from that because there are too many people involved. Why should it be a department rather than an agency, and what would be the advantages of that? That's a question that has been discussed for 20 years or so. I don't think it's that we need to change the number of departments. We need to work in advance to develop a clear idea of what is needed. For example, if we had a centralized defense production department, it wouldn't necessarily change things because we have the concerns now for the economic benefits that are regional and so on. So there's no ideal solution. Our allies around the world have different solutions. Sometimes they have an agency. Some of our allies have developed a ministry or department, but an agency is at arm's length a little bit more, and sometimes it's helpful to have that arm's length arrangement. With respect to accountability, would centralization be more effective? I can't easily answer your question. It might be more effective, but basically, if you have a very senior minister looking after this procurement, then all the colleagues are going to want to know what's going on. And different allies are doing the things differently. It's hard to make a distinction between those decisions and cabinet committees.
Thank you, Mr. Jaramillo. You talked about a different perspective on the NATO 2% spending target. Can you elaborate on that and how you determine that benchmark is calculated, or why you've challenged it in this way?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that pertinent question. Everyone, I believe, in the committee is familiar with the NATO push for spending 2% or beyond 2%, or devoting of GDP to military spending. And I think that there are several misconceptions around this debate. First of all, and including my conversations with colleagues and with everyday Canadians, there's this notion that Canada is somehow lagging, and that Canada is catching up, or that NATO is catching up somehow in terms of its military expenditures. As I said during my opening remarks, globally, Canada is within the top 10%. Within NATO, it's the 6th out of more than 30 military spenders. So this misconception that we're catching up really needs to be balanced with some perspective of the actual numbers. And the measure itself, this metric of percentage of GDP, is an economic measure that tells absolutely nothing about the level of threat or threat perceptions. It's an arbitrary measure that is driving increased defense spending when already it is a highly militarized alliance.
So it doesn't really emphasize where Canada could maximize or be best used, and I know certain countries also place into that calculation how much they spend on Veterans Affairs or a Coast Guard, whereas we look at that differently. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I think Canada could play a very constructive role in broadening the definition of what is considered security and what counts towards those targets that are set. Because I think the traditional understanding and narrow understanding of security will, by definition, evolve in the next few months and years and decades, including consideration of the intersection between environmental degradation and security. So Canada can play a role in terms of having a broader, more accurate, and more current understanding of what constitutes security and what constitutes effective preparedness.
Thank you, Ms. Matheson. Ms. Cramp-Nyman, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, gentlemen. First question to General Foster. In your testimony, you mentioned about the personal deficit that we have in our CAF, and I believe that you certainly can bring a unique perspective, having been in the military and your military experience and now being that in industry. So two-part question, how do we overcome the deficit of 16,000 personnel, and where is the sweet spot, or in Mr. Fadden's comment, the silver bullet, that we can do our fiduciary duty of respecting the taxpayer money and getting the equipment that our armed forces need in this dangerous world that we live in?
Thank you. So in my experience, even working with L3 Harris, I know that we've deployed the C-150 Polaris into Kuwait and has operated out of Iraq with civilians supporting that capability for 4 years. Having deployed in fighters around the world, I have not seen a conflict where we couldn't have technicians on the ground supporting those capabilities, like in Aviano or in Kuwait or in other places. So I think there's a role for industry to be more involved in in-service support capabilities to help the deficit. I think working with AIAC as the chair, we are looking at industry-led aircraft maintenance, engineering training, and I think some of those opportunities could be cross-traded across working with the Canadian military.
Second, Mr. Shmuka, do ITBs add cost to the procurement, or does it just slow it down and make it more expensive?
It's both. Certainly, the ITB program is a bit of an anachronism compared to all of our allies. None of them have maintained such a such a requirement to have 100% offsets, partly because they found, especially in Australia's case and several European allies, that these do slow down the delivery of programs, and they do add costs. There's no way that you can ask a foreign manufacturer to sort of reinvest the entire cost into a country, and then for them to go back to their shareholders or whoever their sort of fiduciary duty is to and say, we're just going to give this money back. So there's going to be an increase in the costs, and they're going to pass that back onto the country. And that's the case with several, any of the major programs that we have that sort of requirement are going to have that sort of effect on our costing and, as I said, on delays as well.
And do you believe that ITBs benefit Canadian companies?
I think it depends on case to case on what program you're talking about. There's certainly an argument to be made that there's an opportunity cost when you look at these programs, is that if we invested the same amount of money that we are, the extra cost that we're spending on a program, if we're going to invest that in the Canadian public in a different way, would that actually have a better economic, industrial outcome than having it done through the ITB VP system? And right now, I would say that the actual data for this is incomplete, but certainly there was the PBO report last year that sort of highlighted how this sort of investments are sort of the distribution of that. And I think it gave you some signs that it may not be actually as effective as, as people believe it to be or sort of argue that it is.
Okay, thank you. Next question, Mr. Fadden. In your testimony, you mentioned a couple points that struck me. Substantive threats, we need to make sure that the country recognizes the threat that we're in, and there's often gridlock due to the fear of litigation. If we can learn from our allies, are there any models internationally that are working with regards to speeding along procurement or waiving the procurement rules that you potentially spoke of? For example, are the British or the Americans, do they have a plan in place?
Well, I think it's probably fair to say, as my colleague said in his remarks, that we have the most complex set of rules amongst our allies by a long shot. So most of our allies move faster than we do. I think our European allies are inclined to move faster because the threat is much more immediate. I mean, we are quite isolated in North America, and I don't think we feel that pressure. The United States, I guess, is in a special category of its own. Its military-industrial complex is so massive. If you talk to admirals and generals, they'll tell you a tale of woe much like the one I just gave you. But they have so much money involved that it does seem to produce, although they're beginning to have problems. But as I tried to say, I don't think there is any country that has found the perfect space to resolve this issue because there are legitimate conflicting objectives.
Okay. Thank you.
Final 5 minutes for this round.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and tremendous thanks to the panelists for being here today. I would like to ask questions of Mr. Foster and Mr. Fadden. I'll start with you, General Foster, if I could. We've talked today about the fact that we're in a constantly evolving security landscape, threat landscape globally. Technology is rapidly evolving. We've seen this with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how Ukraine's reliance on very current and leading-edge technologies has helped it keep its toehold. And we heard from Mr. Fadden as well that advanced IT procurement needs to be very agile because it's changing all the time. I just wondered what your thoughts were on what are the impacts of this rapidly changing landscape on our procurement process now? Like what does it mean for our familiar defense procurement processes?
Well, I can give you an example. The radios, tactical radios that we're exporting into Ukraine are better than what the current Canadian Army is using in their vehicles. To the point where I think it starts to put our Canadian soldiers at risk in terms of their operational capability. Now, I can't speak to exactly that, but that's my understanding. I think that the institution holds on to programs that are taking a long time to get through and are degrading their capability because programs are 5 years behind where they were supposed to have been. And they're not necessarily changing that paradigm or finding a faster solution to get the current equipment they actually need, if that answers your question.
And so then, thank you. That leads into the question, what changes would you recommend to our procurement processes to accommodate the rapidly changing realities?
I think they need to sit down with industry and identify what requirements they actually need to operate in a theater, to look for off-the-shelf solutions, because a lot of the other countries have already solved that problem. I know, for example, the UK has moved quickly on procuring some of those tactical radios. I think aligning yourself with our Western nations to make sure that we're interoperable, I think that would help. And letting go of legacy systems and taking that risk and saying it's time to let that old capability go, and it's time to adopt something new rapidly. Communication equipment and software is changing probably every 2 to 4 years. So working with industry to understand how that service and those software changes are going to rapidly change to keep current is an important, and our traditional procurement of 5 to 10 years is just not going to keep up.
So it sounds like, advice would be don't reinvent the wheel. Existing technologies already have the benefit of interoperability and so forth. So that's a good advice. How does a country like Canada find that? How should we be finding that balance between sort of made in Canada design and build solutions versus the off-the-shelf, often foreign solutions?
So I'd like to address the ITB question a little bit, because I wrestle with that all the time. And problem with procurement is predictability and scope. For me to go to my CEO and say, you need to invest X million dollars in this country to start developing an assembly line for night vision equipment or for radios, he's going to go, okay, what program I'm supporting, and when is it going to happen, and how big is that program going to be? And I go, well, I don't know. And he goes, well, if you don't know, then I can't invest. So the ITB program is designed to put an obligation on a company after they win a program, rather than incentivizing a company like mine to come in and start building assembly lines for night vision goggles. We're competing now with all the other countries, Australia, the UK, Singapore, South Korea, that want us to put that same assembly capability for local content in their countries. Canada should get ahead and start to incentivize large companies like mine to invest in Canada ahead of a program rather than after the fact.
Thank you. Sheriff.
More. Colleagues, I want to thank you for your cooperation and your discipline. We've got 25 minutes to get in a 25-minute round, so if we maintain our cooperation and discipline, we should be able to do it. So, Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, General Foster. In your opening remarks, you said that Canada should not water down criteria in order to create competition where none would otherwise exist. Does this practice currently happen?
Is my belief it does, yes.
Okay. Do you have some examples that you could share with the committee so we would be able to comment on that in our report? If another witness has an example, they could add, that would be fine too. Go ahead.
Future Fighter Capability Project. It was clear right from the start, from 2010, that this should not have been bid as should not have been a contract by DND and PSP, or at the time PSWGC. Coming into a new government, it was politically, obviously there was political issues with it, but the same outcome happened, and you saw sort of reweighting in order to have a competition. When if you looked at every single one of our allies, you look at Finland, you look at all the other countries that bought the F-35.
Okay.
It was clear that was going to be, it was
okay. So that actually even then goes into the point that Mr. Fadden made about politics and opposition politics, and how this weighs into elections. And there's a decades-long history of this. I was in my early formative years of political activism when a government opposed a helicopter contract. So Canadians, though, have become used to this over the decades. So maybe to the point that you made, is there now more risk maybe in the dithering that goes on over years and years and years, sometimes decades, to to produce equipment, even more political risk or embarrassment risk around that than just getting on with something and maybe making a mistake and taking a hit in the short term, politically.
I was going to try as well, but
Yeah, go ahead, either of you.
Well, and I think we, in my remarks, I talked about avoiding developmental programs. Often they will make a competition by introducing a program that is more developmental than perhaps another program, and not understanding what risks and costs that would be associated with. And they end up choosing perhaps a program that requires more development after the fact and does not deliver and does not, and you can think of many of those types of programs that we've, MHP, the Maritime Helicopter Program, was clearly a developmental program paid for in a fixed price contract. That was asking for trouble right from the beginning when you look at it in retrospect.
Okay. Mr. Shmuka, you said in your opening remarks that many 1980s systems that are still in use are rusting out. Can you identify some of the specific ones where we've got systems that have been in place for decades that are the most urgently need to be replaced?
Certainly. I always look at the CF-18s. This aircraft is...
Okay, we talked about that.
Yeah, absolutely. CF-18s. You can look at the CP-140. You can look at our frigates. I mean, there's now reports that one of them are unable to operate. It's across the board. Our systems is
okay, the big ticket ones you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Then. Okay,
but it's also at the lower levels too. I mean, talk about radios, trucks, everything. It is across the forces. You can see it.
Okay. In your remarks, you also talked about the UAV project. 17 years in. Could you explain why this particular project has been problematic? Could you describe what the...
Certainly there's been differing changes in sort of requirements. This, it started basically at the cusp of Afghanistan. There was a requirement then. Then we needed an urgent operational request, so we brought in a temporary, two temporary systems to operate there. Since then, there was there was sort of differing scopes of what do we want to use the project for. I mean, there's multiple different factors. In some ways, it's a good case study to show a lot of the issues that we see in delays in defense procurement, that we see differing changes in requirements, differing in sort of interest in actually spending for what we want to use it for. So it is actually in some ways a microcosm of a lot of these issues kind of brought together into one program.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Fisher, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here today, all four of you. In addition to being a member of the National Defense Committee, I'm also on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I want to go to Major General Foster first. And thank you very much, Major General, for your 35 years of service to our country. I'm interested in the procurement processes. Now, I think it was you, Mr. Foster, that said that Canada's procurement system is very complex. I think that was a bit of a duh moment because we've heard that, of course, under several governments for several decades. But I'm interested, and specifically with some of our NATO allies, what they do well, what we do well, how we can find that low-hanging fruit to improve or simplify our processes. I know some things were talked about today. Understanding that maybe not everything's apples and oranges. I know Canada is much more risk-adverse with regards to litigation. Some countries, some allied nations see litigation as a cost of doing business, so they would add that to the price. I'm just interested in your thoughts on how we can learn from some of our NATO allies. I remember as well, Mr. Fadden, you said that, for some countries, some of our NATO allies, the threat is more imminent or more immediate, so they would need to presumably jump on things a little bit more quickly than we might have to, but interested in your thoughts on that, Mr. Foster.
So I think we need to align our solutions with our allies more. And I think the first person I would look to is the United States, and I would get into their developmental programs. They have very iterative processes they started to put in place in terms of their radio capability, in terms of their software development, that I think Canada would be welcome as a partner in those developments. that would allow us to invest in our own businesses and our small, medium enterprises to participate. And we could collectively do research and development that would be brought to these collective exercises to develop a capability. I think we should also learn to buy off the shelf more often on capabilities that have already been fielded by our allies.
Okay, it's interesting because we've had some questions already about the buying off the shelf. I think that's an interesting topic. But I guess I'll ask you, Mr. Foster and Mr. Fadden, do you have examples of the things that we have done well in the past several decades under different governments of different political stripes? What have we done right, and why did we perhaps not learn from those lessons? Let's start with Mr. Foster.
Well, I think I've heard often the example of the Halifax class frigate program was probably the best developed run program, and that was because industry and government engaged throughout the entire process. And I think there's a fear to engage industry and work with them too often. And I think if you bring enough of industry captains to the table to have a transparent discussion up front before a competition, I think you can get a lot of the clear requirements of the art of the possible of what's out there. What are the best capabilities? We tend right now to put a fence up right away, and then we throw RFIs over the fence and say, "Can you answer this? I have no idea what I'm looking for. Can you help me?" And then we throw it back, and it's back and forth, rather than sitting down in a transparent way to understand right from the beginning what is in the art of the possible, what are likely the best solutions going to be, and then drive that to a competition between probably the appropriate players.
So, and before I go to Mr. Fadden, if the Halifax class was such a success, why would there be presumably this fear, whether it's bureaucrats or whether it's governments of the day, why would there be a fear if we saw that as a success? And I guess, Mr. Fadden, maybe you want to answer that, but I want to share the time a little bit. Oh. Maybe we can let them answer very briefly?
Very briefly.
Thank you.
The problem with the Halifax was not its initial purchase, although that did take a while. It's its midlife refits and its replacement that's the problem. And you wanted two examples of projects that worked well. One was the C-17, the strategic airlift. There was not many alternatives. We bought it through foreign military sales. We wrote the United States a check, and they delivered the aircraft. The other one may be slightly more controversial, but Mr. Harper's government waived all the rules to have that supply ship constructed, the Asterix. It was delivered on time and on budget. And it's an example, I think, of where the rules were appropriately suspended because the military was convinced we needed a supply ship then, not later.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Surprise, surprise, some guy from Halifax thinks that a Halifax program is a great program. Yeah. We got two guys thinking they're great. 2.5 minutes, Monsieur Thérault.
Mr. Thériault, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you. I would like to ask Mr. Shumuka a question because I know he is a specialist in procurement issues and aircraft. When I first heard about the F-35, I was younger than I am now. It was under the Chrétien government in 1997. Now we are talking about getting our first F-35 in 2026. So my brief question is, will the adapted infrastructure be in place? And if we want the best technology, why not think in terms of drones? I'm wondering about the useful life of the craft that we are providing to our military.
So I'm not entirely sure about the actual infrastructure side. I know the government has certainly put forward sort of several programs to build out the infrastructure at Bagotville and Cold Lake. I think the bigger issue with the transition towards the F-35 is actually the personnel side, is that as we see, the RCAF is well below the actual required established strength for its pilots and its maintainers. Its ability to actually transition towards a fighter fleet, sure, we may get the first one in 2026. The question is, when will we have our full fleet, and when will it actually be fully operational? I believe the dates was supposed to be 2031, 32. The reality is it's probably significantly further away from that because the Air Force cannot fill the seats with pilots to sort of fly the aircraft and also maintain it. To your questions about drones, I would point that I think we certainly, especially there's technology challenges operating in the north. If you look at how air warfare is developing as well, you still need a man in the loop. You still need somebody there to sort of provide the sort of the final point of sort of human contact to operate fighters. Drones just are not at the stage where they can actually operate in the same effective way, and thus, we will require an aircraft that will sort of is a manned fighter. But if you look at just some of the developments going forward, you also see aircraft that are it's man-machine teaming, where drones are going to be controlled by a single man fighter like the F-35 or a next-generation aircraft in that way.
Madison.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Giammarillo, there are some campaigns calling on governments, United Nations, to bring forward preemptive limitations on emerging technologies, in defense. Could you talk about the importance of those proactive regulations when we're talking about emerging technologies and how that can be implemented within our procurement strategy?
Absolutely. Thank you for that pertinent question. There is a growing consensus. Emerging technologies that can be integrated into military systems will pose all sorts of questions related to ethical implications, legal implications, uncharted territory from a normative perspective. And the international community is paying some attention to these issues, to the fact that it is really uncharted territory, and there are a lot of questions about how the use and the employment of emerging military technologies would be compliant with fundamental precepts of, for instance, international humanitarian law, such as distinction, precaution, proportionality, etc. Canada has participated in meetings in Geneva of the Convention of CCW Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, as well as there has been some discussion domestically. However, we feel that the pace, the rapidity of these developments is such that Canada really must more proactively and more assertively craft a regulatory regime and start that conversation towards a normative regulatory regime, because these risks are real. They could affect not only potential adversaries, but indeed Canadian citizens. And it is really a matter of getting ahead of the game, because these technologies will be incorporated into the military. But we cannot operate on a normative void, and it is quite imperative for Canada to both domestically and internationally contribute to the development of such a normative regime.
Sorry? Oh, well, just quickly then, I guess, are we doing a good job in terms of our procurement strategy of also including issues like climate change into that procurement strategy?
Well, the question is, what policy direction does this procurement strategy respond to? As I said, Strong, Secure, Engaged is already from 2017. 6 years is a long time in terms of the evolution of the security landscape and security environment. So all of these conversations, even about F-35, about new capability, about shipbuilding, about all of these things, must beg the question, what is the intended role of the Canadian Armed Forces? And in that context, references to, for instance, to the United States or the United Kingdom or other allies may or may not be fully relevant, because Canada has identified Arctic sovereignty, protection of Canadian citizens, for instance, peacekeeping, as historical priorities that may not align with those of our allies. So they're instructive.
We're going to have to leave
some
that.
extent.
We're going to have to leave the response there. Thank you. Mr. Bazan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to challenge Mr. Fadden a bit. He said that, political opposition has created problems in the past, and that we have looking towards us. And I can say that in the last 8 years, there's only one procurement that the opposition has criticized, and that was the purchase of used F-18s from Australia, as both a waste of money and two, we don't have the pilots to fly them, was the main reason for doing it. But everything else we have been quiet about, and I can say that I've received criticism for not being political enough and to try to move some of these procurements forward. That being said, and looking at General Foster, looking at you, Mr. Fadden, and Dr. Shmoka, because you guys have all written about this in the past, the department itself, and the department was in here last week talking procurement and actually criticized industry for not moving fast enough, or they aren't going to build stuff if nobody's going to buy it, or they don't have stuff that the world wants, like M155 munitions, that we could be doing right now, north of Montreal. We have other facilities that build stuff that the world needs right now, including Canada. So D&D often takes a long time in defining the procurement and then changes the goalposts and keeps moving them down the field, like we've seen on the service combatant as a good example. Adding time, delays, and we still don't have a final blueprint to actually go out there and start cutting steel at Irving. So how can we fix that process? And General Foster, you talked about better cooperation between industry and CAF, but also within the department to ensure that we are addressing things in a more expedient manner. Is it industry's fault? Is it the department's fault? Is it, generals and admirals not getting things right or having too big a wish list that may make things impossible?
I just want to address one thing. We talked about the F-35. So this is that is a game changer in terms of both security, both in terms of C4ISR, interoperability, JADC2. That is an enabler, and I think this is where this is the right time for industry and government to sit down and map that out carefully. It took the Australians 6 years to get the infrastructure and security requirements in place to accept the first F-35. We've talked to BAE. In terms of the transition of the F-18, industry can help transition the F-35 and the F-18 to ensure that if we can actually get them pilots to help with the transition, we can actually improve their maintenance. It's determining what's required and making the decision to get on with it, as opposed to defaulting to the traditional, have to go through the competition process, have to make it fair and transparent. This is a national sovereign issue. I think that's where often we get trip up in terms of getting things done and not allowing ourselves to get on with the case at hand. In terms of adding requirements and, you mentioned the Canadian service combatant, which has been going on for several years. I don't think you'll ever be able to stop some confusion or some issues that pop up with requirements. But I think fundamentally there was a disconnect in terms of the initial requirements that were asked for and the understanding of what the proposal was.
Mr. Shmoka, Mr. Fadden?
I concede your point about criticism, but I hope you'll concede mine that whether there is criticism or not, it's embedded in the culture, and people are simply afraid of it. But I take your point. One of the things that used to drive me to distraction when I was in defense was the number of change orders across the board. I blame myself and my civilian colleagues for not pushing back harder on the generals and the admirals, because they always want a gold-plated solution to their problems because it protects lives. But I think even within the military, there's sort of a gentleman and gentlewoman's understanding that, if the Air Force wants this, the Army's not going to criticize it. So it's very difficult to get effective review as you work your way up the system. And one of the few things that survived my time there was a committee that's now chaired, or was chaired, by Admiral Murray, that is supposed to review these kinds of things before they leave the department. A lot of it is, I think, a desire to do good, but there honestly is a lack of self-discipline, both on the departmental side and on the military side, in my view.
Thank you, Mr. Brazan, unfortunately. Is Mr. Collins first?
I'll start.
Okay, Madame Lambrou.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll be splitting my time with Mr. Collins. Mr. Foster, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. You mentioned that it's better to invest in areas that are already really developed rather than trying to create competition where it doesn't already exist within these industries. First of all, I'd like you to maybe go over which Canadian industries excel in this area and where is our capacity more limited relative to our partners and allies. And then if you can also answer the question that I had asked Mr. Fadden about what steps Canada can take in order to better balance the needs for efficient, agile procurement with the goal of actually increasing domestic capacity.
That could take a long time to answer all that, but right off the top, Canada invested in R&D in Westcam, invested in our Dorval division, which was CAA at the time, to develop the integrated platform management system. Those two systems are globally accepted as world leader capabilities. It was that research and development cooperation with industry, as opposed to an ITB value proposition investment thinking, that made those capabilities. If you look at CAE, they are world-class in training. We should continue to develop in that kind of capability, and we have other industries, Blue Drop training, for example, that are very good at that. We have great capabilities in cyber technology. So, I've talked to the president of NRC, and if we were to collectively get industry to look at and map out where Canada really is the leading expert in capabilities and really invest in those capabilities, we could be competitive in the future.
Thanks. Mr. Chairman, if I could, to Mr. Fadden. Mr. Fadden, the PBO appeared before the committee, talked about the number of hands that are on the steering wheel as a project makes its way through the procurement process. And they emphasized, for efficiency and accountability purposes, one point of contact. Your thoughts on that in light of the fact that you were deep in the weeds on many of these big projects as they've made their way through the system?
I think at one level, at a theoretical level, I think they're correct. But in a practical sense, as long as you have a variety of policy objectives, both internal to the department and external to the department, it's very difficult to have one focal point. If you want somebody within the Canadian Armed Forces to be responsible for a particular acquisition, that's great, but he or she can't be responsible for the regional components, for the technological components, for the innovation components. So I think it's desirable, and I think we need to improve what we're doing, but to all of a sudden say we have this one person responsible for everything in the current small p political environment, by which I don't mean partisan, I just mean political environment, I don't think it's going to work.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Colleagues, you've been so cooperative and disciplined. We've actually got 2 minutes left. No, you won't. I will. I wanted to pick up on General Foster's comment about the U.S., working with the U.S. and our colleagues there. I am interested in your concern, or your level of concern with Canada's domestic status, being treated as a domestic supplier for the purposes of supplying military equipment. Do you think we are at risk there?
I think the U.S. has better capability. It's recognized, if that's what you're getting at, in terms of our own domestic industry providing that kind of capability. I think there's a balance. I think what I'm getting at is how we are treated as a foreign entity by the U.S. defense industry, particularly the government of the United States. Do you think that there's any risk that we may lose that status, which we've had, I think, since 1954, of being treated as a domestic supplier? No, I don't think that's a risk, but I think there's a better opportunity to work with the U.S. and increase our own domestic business capabilities by being a better supplier in that value chain. And I think that's a government-to-government discussion that says we're going to spend this much money on over-the-horizon radar, and we want to align with the solution you choose, but we want you to invest with that large solution that the U.S. companies are going to bring into the Canadian supply chain.
Okay. Yeah.
Mr. Chair, just want to let everybody know that today is Air Force Day on the Hill, and everybody should muster up over in Valor Room 228.
I don't know whether that's a point of order, but it certainly is an announcement. I wanted to thank each and every one of you for your cooperation. We're in strange waters here, and to colleagues, stay tuned as to whether Thursday will happen. We're hoping that it will. So with that, meeting adjourned.